All right, to put the fallout from the axing of the French submarine deal into some perspective and take a closer look at today's news poll, I'm joined from Melbourne by the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, Mr. Greg Sheridan. Greg, love having you on the show. Thank you for your time. Over the weekend, the French government recalled their ambassador to Canberra and has started to threaten the whole EU trade deal, which is currently in negotiations. But when it's all said and done, it's hardly surprised, is it, that they're upset? Of course they're upset. They've lost a $90 billion deal, but we've got to do what's in our national interest. And if you're going to break eggs, as my mother would say, you've got to break them to make an omelette. This is the right move for Australia. We will manage the French relationship, but we shouldn't be backing down here.
No, absolutely right, Peter. Look, I think the French reaction is just utterly ridiculous. This from a country who blows up Greenpeace vessels in New Zealand, kills an activist, and then, intimidates New Zealand into releasing their agent who did the murder. I mean, what a joke. The French double standards are ridiculous. But look, Australia has done nothing wrong here, nothing wrong at all. First of all, the contracts were structured in a way that they were a series of sequential contracts. And it was very clear, very explicit. I wrote about it. Everybody said it right from the start, that we had a series of off-ramps. You pay for stage A. If you're happy at the end of stage A and you haven't gone broke and you still think it's a relevant capability, you go ahead and do stage B. We haven't broken any contracts. We've decided not to go ahead. And this was the worst kept secret in Canberra. Nobody knew about the nuclear deal. Congratulations, the government, on getting the nuclear threshold and keeping that secret. But, you know, there had been the Mead review. Everyone in Canberra knew the government was looking at alternatives. The government had delayed going ahead with the next stage of work for 6 months or something. If the French didn't know that the government was looking at alternatives, they were only people on the whole planet. I think Emmanuel Macron's reaction is ridiculous, but I think it's driven by the French election next April. And he can now say this perfidious cabal of Anglo-Saxons, the dreadful Brits, the untrustworthy Americans and the dreadful Australians have ganged up on poor, honourable, noble Gallic France. And I think it's just utter baloney, and it'll blow over after the election.
Well, I think that 60,000 dead Australians lying in cemeteries all around northern France gives us the bloody right to change our mind in our own national interest. I don't take any backward step there with the French. You made the point in your column over the weekend. You said that nuclear subs will take too long to build. And you're absolutely right. This has been a concern of yours for some time. It's interesting, Peter Dutton, who's in the United States at the moment, he has opened the door to leasing the Virginia class from the Americans or the Astute class to fill this sort of capability gap. That's got to happen, doesn't it?
Oh, I think so. I think they need to do that. In fact, I think... Australia has a bipartisan record of terrible failure in submarine acquisition. The submarines we use today were commissioned by Bob Hawke in the 1980s. They'll be the submarines we'll use probably into the 2020s and the 2030s and maybe even into the 2040s. The original timeline, we take 18 months to think things over. We start building at about the end of this decade and we get our first nuclear sub in 2040. So that means two things. One, it's got no relevance to the China strategic challenge. And two, nobody can believe it because you can't believe a government for more than 6 months, much less 20 years. But Dutton gets this, and I think Morrison does too. And the quickest way you can short circuit it is to get a leased submarine. Needn't even be a Virginia class. The Americans are retiring their old Los Angeles class attack subs early. Now, if we got one of those with 5 years of its life left, it could be captained by an American. It can start out as a training boat and then become an interim capacity. It could be captained by an American on secondment to the Royal Australian Navy. The Americans could provide half the crew. But this program isn't real until we get an Australian-flagged nuclear submarine. Once we've got one, you can bet we'll get plenty more. Building them in Adelaide, maybe a long time down the track, but it'll take us 10 years to do that. We can't wait for 10 years. No. Mind you, we couldn't crew them at the moment, so it's going to take us a few years to train up a crew. We've made such a mess of this submarine thing that we're starting in a terrible spot. But you've got to have a sub within 4 or 5 years, I think.
Look, and I think you're right. If you bring over an American boat now, even if it has partial American crew, it helps lock the Labor Party in here because already over the weekend there's been some movement, particularly on the left, and this is critically important. It doesn't get, this decision doesn't get revisited every time government changes.